Well, I would say find yourself a difficult cognitive problem to solve. Pick a challenge. But you also might consider talking to someone. You find relief when you drink alcohol. That might be an indication that some of what you're overanalyzing isn't so much a consequence of excess cognitive power, but an excess of high negative emotion. And so that would be illustrated in, say, high trait neuroticism. We're going to release the Big 5 aspect scale here later this month, and you'll be able to take that, and it'll give you a pretty good detailed description of your personality. And there's 2 dimensions of neuroticism, withdrawal and volatility. And, if you're overanalyzing because you're what do you call that? Ruminating, that can be a consequence of high levels of anxiety. And the reason I'm suggesting that is because you said you find relief when you drink alcohol, and alcohol is a very powerful anxiolytic agent, anti-anxiety agent. And so lots of people who have high levels of anxiety do ruminate, and so overanalyze, let's say. And they find relief when they drink because alcohol is a primary anxiolytic, like Valium, like benzodiazepines and barbiturates. So the fact that alcohol gives you relief probably indicates that some of what's driving your overanalysis is anxiety. And then you could, exercise can really help with that. I would also recommend, this is something really to think about, I don't know what your eating habits are like or your sleeping habits, but if you are an anxious person and that's manifesting itself in, say, neurotic overanalysis, there's 2 things you can do very rapidly, 3 things really, that will help quell that. 4 things even. Number 1, get up at the same time every day. And I would recommend in the morning because that's when people generally get up, and it's good to do what everyone else does unless you have a good reason not to. Number 2, eat a large breakfast, right? Keep it carbohydrate light. Don't eat toast and and Fruit Loops. That's not going to do the trick. Make it fat and protein heavy, and eat more than you want. You might say, I'm not hungry in the morning. It's like, this has nothing to do with what you want or what your appetite is. It's like, you need to eat in the morning. If you're an anxious person and you don't eat in the morning and then you stress yourself out, your body hyperproduces insulin. It takes all the blood sugar out of your blood, and that dysregulates your metabolism for the entire day. You can't reset it till you go to sleep at night. And I've had lots of anxious clients who would say fall into the overanalytic category, who were like virtually cured by eating a large breakfast every morning. I would highly recommend that. You could try some physical exercise. Weightlifting is really good for curing anxiety. Another thing you could do, as I alluded to earlier today, is to make a schedule and start attending to your daily micro routines. So, you got to figure out what your overanalysis is. It might be cognitive, like maybe you have a very active mind, you're fast verbally. Are you fast verbally? One way you can find that out is to do something like write down as many words as you can that begin with the letter S, for example, in 3 minutes. Do that with a bunch of your friends. And if you're someone who writes down way more words than anyone else, then you're verbally fluent, and that might be driving some of your overanalysis. But my guess is that you're suffering from some rumination that's related to anxiety. And so I told you what I think the simplest ways are to rectify that. If you're really high in openness and you're really high in neuroticism, that can be a rough combination. The conscientiousness should actually help with that, although it might make you a bit perfectionistic. The problem with being high in openness, which is creativity and interest in ideas, and high in neuroticism, which is tendency towards anxiety and emotional pain, is that like open people like to break open boxes, conceptual boxes, and see what's inside, like Pandora's box. But people who are high in neuroticism are more likely to respond negatively to complexity and uncertainty. And if you're an open person and you're always thinking up new things, you tend to saw off the branch that you're sitting on a regular basis. And that can be pretty destabilizing. Any tips on dealing with that? Well, I would repeat what I said earlier. I think that one of the things that you do if you're high in anxiety is to stabilize your sleep-wake cycles. So get up at the same time, go to bed at the same time, and eat at the same time. Make sure that you eat breakfast, and a big breakfast too, that's heavy on fat and protein. Because if you're hungry and then you stress yourself, especially if you're high in neuroticism, you destabilize your insulin production system, and it won't be stabilized till you go to sleep again. So I would say like 2 things. One is have a big breakfast, and then also if you're feeling particularly anxious, try eating something, not carbohydrates, and see if that helps, because you might be somewhat permanently dysregulated in your stress-related insulin production. That would be worth trying. I would also say that you should shield yourself to some degree from news sources and sources of bad news, especially catastrophic news, because most of it isn't news. It's the repetition of things that we already know full well. And there's reason to protect yourself from an onslaught of negative information, especially when it's not really necessary for you. I mean, I don't think you should bury your head in the sand, but constant exposure to the catastrophes of the world, especially when there's nothing that you can do about those catastrophes, even hypothetically, is something that can really destabilize people. I often tell people in my clinical practice, which isn't operating right now, by the way, to shield themselves from news reports, because it's just too much. If you're depressed and anxious, it's just not something that you need. It's not helpful to you. Second percentile in agreeableness and extroversion. Well, you know, one of the things that you can do if you're that low in agreeableness, that shouldn't dysregulate your emotions, but it might interfere with your relationships with other people, you know, because you might be a little bit harder to, you might take other people's feelings into consideration less than might be good for you. One of the things that people who are low in agreeableness can do is to try to think of things they could do for other people and make that a practice. You know, like maybe once a week you could consciously do someone a favor or give someone a gift, something like that, and practice being, what would you call it, compassionate and polite. You know, that'll expand your personality rather than transforming it. So then maybe you could have the advantages of being disagreeable, which means you're tough-minded and skeptical and competitive, and those can all be really good things. But it would be nice to be able to leaven that a little bit with the ability to take other people's perspectives a bit more and to take them into account. And then, you know, if your relationships improve, that can also improve your emotional stability, because one of the ways that people regulate their anxiety is by having people around them that they get along with. Because, you know, if you upset people, then they upset you, and especially if you're high in neuroticism, and that can increase your anxiety and your pain. So that's Sisyphus, and Nietzsche said of Sisyphus, if I remember correctly, that one has to imagine him happy. Well, if there's a rock at the bottom of the hill, then you might as well push it up the hill. And if it rolls back down, well, then you've got something else to do, don't you? You can push the damn rock back up the hill. And there's no shortage of rocks to push up the hill, and that's what we're built for anyways. And so let's go out and push some damn boulders up the hill, and then maybe we could have enough self-confidence and enough respect for ourselves that we wouldn't have to turn to hatred and revenge and try to take everything down, because I think that's the alternative. So he's not weak. That's one thing you can say about him. The same idea represented there, right? That's Atlas, who voluntarily takes the world on his shoulders. It's like the idea of Christ taking the sins of the world on his shoulders. It's exactly the same notion, which is the notion that you should be able to recognize in yourself all the horror of humanity and take responsibility for it, because that's what that means. And the thing that's so interesting about that is that if you can recognize in yourself all the horror of humanity, you will instantly have a hell of a lot more respect for yourself than you did before you did that. Because there's some real utility in knowing that you're a monster. Now, and just because you're a monster doesn't mean you have to be a monster, but it's really useful to know that you are one. So, and one of the things that Jung knew, and this is something that I find so amazing about his writings, and I think something that really distinguishes him, for example, from Joseph Campbell, who talked about following your bliss, is like Jung said very clearly that the first step to enlightenment is the encounter with the shadow. And what he meant by that was, everything horrible that human beings have done was done by human beings, and you're one of them. And so if you don't understand that, and to understand that really means to know how it was that you could have done it, and that's a shattering thing. To try to imagine that, to try to imagine yourself as someone who's engaged in medieval torture, to see how you could in fact do that. You're never the same after you learn that. But being never the same after learning that is unbelievably useful, because when you understand that that's what you're like, then you're a whole different creature. And I don't think, and this is something I did learn from Jung, is that you cannot be a good person until you know how much evil you contain within you. It is not possible. And it's partly because you just don't have any potency. Like,
If you're just naive, if you're just nice, if you'd never hurt anyone, you'd never hurt a fly, you don't have the capability for any of that, why would anyone ever take you seriously? You're a domestic animal at best, and a rather contemptible one at that. And it's a very strange thing, because you wouldn't think that the revelation of capacity for evil is a precondition for the realization of good. But I believe, first of all, why would you be serious enough to even attempt to pursue the good unless you had some sense of what the consequence was of not doing it? You have to be serious about these sorts of things. It's not the game of a child, right? It's the game of a fully developed adult. And I learned this in part when I had little kids. I wrote a chapter from my new book called Never Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them. And why was that? And I wrote that after I knew I was a monster. And I thought, I'm going to make sure I like my kids. I'm going to make sure they behave around me so that I like them. Because I'm way bigger than them. And I'm way more cruel than they are. And I've got tricks up my sleeve that they cannot even possibly imagine. And if they irritate me, I will absolutely take it out on them. And if you don't think that you're the sort of person that would do that, then you are the sort of person who is doing it.
Psychopaths. I say this, I hope non-naively, also having dealt with psychopaths in my clinical practice, and I would say now and then in my life, I don't believe in psychopaths. I don't believe that we know enough to say there are people born without conscience. I don't think the psychometric measurement of psychopathy is everything that it should be. I've been trying to model it in the big five domain. I think, now it's complicated because, so I would say a psychopath, a classic psychopath, is likely extroverted, especially assertive, disagreeable, and unconscientious, and maybe extremely low in neuroticism, so you can't frighten them. So that's a rare combination because it's extreme on many traits, right? But that I don't believe that means that someone with that personality configuration is doomed from birth to a pathological existence. Because there's things about psychopathy that the classifiers, those who claim, like Cleckley, that the psychopath is born in some sense, can't explain. It's like, well, what about the cruelty? There seems to be a motive there. They're passionless and they lack emotion. Well, why are they cruel then? For entertainment? Well, but then you have to explain the entertainment motivation. Like there's a failure in some sense with the classic psychopathy theorists to come to grips with the problem of malevolence. It's skirted over. And you can't do that if you're talking about psychopathy. It's like malevolence is the bloody issue here. And so the other issue with the psychopath is that he's irredeemable, right? That's the idea. I don't think we know enough to make such claims. Now, and that doesn't, I know the psychopathy literature quite well, and I have great respect for the primary researchers in the field. I want to make that perfectly clear. But we're approaching the problem from a different level of analysis here, something like a spiritual level of analysis. And I don't think that there's an easy translation from the descriptive, psychometric, psychiatric approach to the spiritual level. They don't match. And I'm more likely to say, let's not assume the soul is doomed from birth, right? And I'm loath to think that there are people born irredeemable. Although I do think there are irredeemable people. The death penalty issue is interesting in that regard, because I've read a lot about really terrible people. And I've also read a lot about what really terrible people said about themselves. And many of them wished for the death penalty. And so it's absolutely clear that there are things that you can do that deserve the death penalty. But that doesn't mean that the state should have the right to impose it. That's a different question. So